right, Scott Peterson's 18 New England. What can we say? What can we say? Oh. So, I guess to start with, I really enjoyed it. I think it's one of the better playing 18xx's out there. And that might make sense because everything about its design had to do with gameplay concerns rather than really trying to reimagine the modeling of the system. But at the same time, it's not just a tinkering around the edges. It's a major difference from most XXs in terms of how it actually plays. Now, as with most 18xx games that I cover, especially the weirder ones, and I don't think this is a particularly weird one, but I cover some of the really fringe stuff in the series, I guess. So people tell me. A lot of those tend to be, throwing more new concepts in. Some of the Lenny Ogler games are really, tossing in some new element that needs to be simulated and trying to keep it within the gameplay constraints. This one instead said, hey, what if, there are certain things about 18xx games that tend to bother me. This is from the designer's point of view, Scott Peterson. He's done quite a few. That tend to bother me. Can we change them in this way, that way? I guess the big difference in this game is you can't float a public corporation. The only way, people compare it a lot to the mechanisms in 1861, and it draws heavily from those, which involve mergers and whatnot. The big difference in this one is the only way you start a public corporation is from one of your minor companies. And the minor companies are available through a drafting procedure at the beginning of the game, but they also remain out there to be purchased later in the game. And indeed, five of them always, will not even be available at the beginning of the game. And that's random. And that's the random thing in this particular game is which minor companies are you going to get to start the game. The public corporations are named, and you might have difficulty, as you might in 1861, in getting sort of a company in the right locale to fit what its name says. These are, I think, all real railways. I don't know about Boston and Albany, but I'm assuming it is. Central Vermont, Providence, and Worcester. Providence and Worcester sounds like it should be a minor, damn it. But anyway. At least one of them kind of disturbs me on a naming basis, which is the Canadian National Railway. It probably shouldn't be created out of a merger with or an expansion of some minor company that is present in the United States. That doesn't feel right. Knowing, 1856, which handles and is all about kind of the creation of the Canadian National Railway, in the same way that 1835 is about the creation of the Prussian. But the Canadian National was founded out of debt rather than just a consolidation of miners. So yeah, that's one big factor to it. Another big factor is that it is quite possible in fact likely, that you're going to be able to get your corporation, once you get a public corporation in play, you're going to be able to get 2 permanent trains on it if you manage things well and don't get unlucky, whatever. So that's a major boost. And the way that the permanent trains work in this is they're a doubling factor. They're the E-style trains. What they work with is, if you've got one of them, it runs fine and it's able to skip doinkers, which can create some pretty hefty runs. Runs that, on the high end, I think we saw a 50 run, 51 actually, but, and that's with an 8 train, but one that can skip the doinkers. If you get 2 of them, they make the same run as the lowered value one, but then double that. And that's actually got a lot of advantages to it. One of which is, well, I don't know if it's advantages. It's got one big advantage that I clearly point out as positive, but which is that it makes it easier to count your runs. Towards the end of the game, the only thing you have to count with those big trains is a single run, and you double it. So you don't have to worry about crossing track and all that. You do in the mid-game, but there you're facing doinkers and everything, and the trains have smaller runs. They're no higher than a 4 train, so those tend to be pretty easy to do. I've found some XX games which allow, you to have 2 big 8 trains or diesels or whatever, end up just creating these hellacious run optimization problems, even without making decisions on what track you're going to lay. They just become really, really painful to figure out your runs. Here it was very easy. And it also means that your run actually tends to be more stable, because you're usually, unless you have the 8 train perhaps, but for the most part, you reach a certain point in your run and it's not going to improve anymore. You might be able to block somebody off, and there's ample opportunity for that. Component-wise, they are excellent. All Aboard does a fantastic job on components. These are nice stock, nice and slick feeling, really, really sweet. One thing I gripe about is the rule book is glossy. There was an error on it. I had to write it in a pen because pencil won't work on glossy rule books. You got a player aid that I never used. Extra piece of track that I didn't use. One thing I would like is if there had been some replacement stickers. They give you a bunch of replacement wooden pieces, and that actually ended up confusing me. It's not a terrible thing. They give you a wooden whale. That's always helpful. There is a priority card. The cards, as usual nowadays, high quality. The track tiles, really, really nice quality. Very thick. I mean, it just puts the early games to shame, even the Mayfair ones that I used to love the quality of. And I look at the GMT stuff that's coming out nowadays, and I was going to make a comparison. Wow, this kind of blows away the GMT. I don't know. 18 India looks pretty ramped up too. I think what's happening is the 18XX market is, it's a niche market within the gaming community. I don't know if it's more so than wargaming is. I think so, but I think there are less 18XX players than there are wargamers, at least from the views of my videos. But it could just be that I cover 18XX more poorly, or whatever. It definitely does feel like a niche part of the hobby, but one that current printing capabilities and whatnot, and the price point that the market will bear, these games are able to come out with really sweet components. Um, I think GMT is finding they can make big enough runs and guarantee to sell them that they've upped the quality of their components as well. Um, Although they were above and beyond what used to be available, right? But these days of having to get what are essentially print and plays or whatnot, or not. I know there are people who loved before all the board started taking them over. Uh, that loved. I can't remember what the company is. Deep Thought, I think. Uh, put out like these foam core boards and stuff like that. And, they were really, really outstanding print and plays, is what they came down to. Highest quality print and plays that you could kind of get. Um, and you could just print them yourself, or you could end up buying, the very expensive hand assembled uh, sets. And I'm very happy that All Aboard exists and is, along with other companies, and is just sort of putting out some of the 18xx's. Honestly, if people can get the rights to it, I know 1830 got republished, but some of the other older ones, hey, it's cool that I have them, but some of the other older ones could certainly do with a republication, if you know if you're able to get them out there and still make a profit. That's the big question: is, hey, what happens? Who's got rights to them and everything, and it becomes a more complicated thing. But stuff like 1856, I think a lot more people should be able to see that game in particular. I think that's the one that I most see as really in need of a reprint, because it's my favorite, or has been. Um, let's take a look, see if I have anything else to say. So, yeah, this is a partial cap game, but kind of a weird partial capitalization game. Like I said, you have to have a miner to float to get you to the point, where you have a public corporation. And you don't get to set your par value. That is kind of set by the type of mechanism you use to create a major corporation, and perhaps the stock value, the initial valuation that you set for your miner. Now, what's weird is the miners don't have any valuation on their own. They're set by filling these dots down here. And the later set is set by filling these dots. And you've got 10 of these yellow dots, so every miner corporation that starts the game, or every miner company that starts the game, ends up filling one of these slots, and they probably will all get filled. And that's going to be, double that is going to be your starting capital, which ensures that you have enough to buy a train at the beginning of the game. Well, at the beginning of the game, all the 2 trains go away. There's like 10 of them, and there's 10 minor companies, and, I'm guessing every minor company starts in almost every game, because there's nowhere else to put your money initially. It isn't until the 3 trains show up that you're allowed to merge. So one of the miners has to make it to the point where it has that extra $180 or whatever. And, they split 50-50 like normal. But anyway, what I was getting to is, it's a partial capitalization game, but kind of weird. Because not only do you float it out of the miner, and you start off with just a presidency of the corporation at that point, 20% of the corporation. But and shares that players buy go into the company as per any of the partial capitalization games. But the big corporations have the right to issue their IPO shares into the bank pool. And there's no real harm to doing this. So you can basically raise another 50% of the company's revenue just with a release. So you can pretty much ensure that you're going to be, since you have the 20% share, that you're going to have 70% of the shares outstanding. Now, the 20% share the president's share doesn't really necessarily generate you any money. If you do a merger, it does not. If you do a conversion, it generates cash, but only cash that's the difference between the starting value of the miner that you had and $100 par value. So if you started your company at under $100, your miner company at under $100, you're going to have to put in a difference for those two shares. So let's say you started it at 90, you would have to, the difference is 10, but there's two shares, so you would have to put in $20 of your own capital to do that conversion into a major corporation. That's not a lot of money that you're throwing in for that 20% share. So honestly, you're able to raise 5 shares worth of money by releasing your IPO. But once you have your IPO released, there's a mechanism for bootstrapping that probably doesn't come in until the late game, where you buy shares back at their current value, and then you can re-release them on another operating round for their new, hopefully higher stock value. The IPO shares always generate the same IPO value. Now this is kind of interesting. The IPO shares are all available to the players. Any player can buy them, whether they've been released to the bank pool or if they're sitting in the company treasury. If they're in the company treasury, the player who's buying an IPO share does not pay the IPO cost. They pay the full stock value for the corporation, whatever that may be, which might be lower than the IPO, the par value. But the company gets the par value in capitalization funds, whatever, in monies in their treasury, which is just a very, very weird mechanism. And this is important because it kind of violates any concept of reality in terms of financing. Like if a corporation, so the corporation gets run money based on however many certificates it has sitting in its treasury. Whether those are IPO shares that have never left the corporate treasury, or if they're redeemed shares that have been repurchased and that they're holding to be able to release later, presumably to buy a train. There is no way that a corporation that's holding, say, 30% of its shares, and it's kind of a weird situation because honestly, a corporation doesn't hold its own shares, right? What it does is it buys them back. That increases the value of the share price across the board because there's less shares available. And then it chooses to pay out different dividend rates based on the actual outstanding shares and whatnot. It doesn't make a decision of. It's not like there's these 10% shares. These have always been a gameplay mechanism to make life easy, to make the calculations much easier. But anyhow, there's just no way that a corporation is like releasing additional shares and only getting what it was initially valued at, even though the public is willing to subscribe at a much higher value. And I don't know what's being represented there. You could try making some hand-wavy argument about bank loans and stuff like that. I don't buy any of it. To me, the stock market in this one is not really representative of anything in reality. Anyway, enough on that. The first stock round is all about buying the miners. And then something really weird happens, because the 3 trains take a while to come out. And when they do, the train rush becomes fairly brutal, actually. But the 3 trains take a while to come out, so you basically have a game running with no stock rounds. Yeah, they happen, but nobody's got stock they're allowed to buy. Nobody's able to sell. You're just sitting on your miners and running them for a significant part of the early game. And then the first 3 train falls. And then starts coming the question, do you want to trade in a 50-50 split of revenue from your miner for a major corporation which has a stronger, it has an ability to build up a bigger holding in terms of what city, how many dots it can put out in cities, how many trains it can hold, whatever. But essentially you're trading in a 50% share for a 20% share. But the difference is the major corporation can increase in stock value. The miners will not. So it's probably worth converting in most cases, but there might be good reasons to hold on to your miner because it does bring in such a high income. And also the fact that it's 50-50, you're getting cash on hand that you can invest in stocks, and your miner is getting cash that it can invest in trains or blowing or blasting or whatever. So that's kind of an intriguing situation. Also, miners come out later in the game, and they can be formed then. What's weird about that is they come out when the first 3 train comes out. This new set of miners here. Well, the $90 and $100 slot allow you to buy a train. The $80 slot does not. That gives you only $160. The 3 train is, I believe, $180. Yeah. The 3 train is $180, which is pretty much a standard value for it, but and what that means is you might have to throw in an additional $20 to fund a train for your miner. Now, if you already have an extra train on a miner or on a public corporation, you can buy trains off them. So there's some opportunity for some wheeling and dealing here. And this is one point at which, if someone's invested in your major corporation, they might end up owning a raped company. That's okay, though. What you're going to find in this game as a whole is that the gameplay is a lot less cutthroat in terms of raping companies, dumping them, that kind of scheme. That doesn't really exist here. And the other thing that doesn't exist is manipulation of the stock market. There's very little reason. Well, first of all, the way stocks are valued, They don't go down unless the president sells shares. And if the president sells shares, they go down one per share that the president sells. So if a president's dumping his company, the stock value could just tank. But under every other circumstance, the president probably isn't selling off a share of his company unless he gets to 60%, and for some reason, I don't know. I can't think of a good reason for this. In 56, there's this weird mechanism in play where you want to get yourself to 60% and then sell a share so that you can keep capitalizing your company during a certain period of the game. Most games, you don't really want to do anything like that. In fact, the full cap games in general, it's to your advantage to keep the shares. Well, in 56 and 30, it's to your advantage to have shares sitting in the bank pool for various reasons. And there's no reason you want them in the treasury. Anyway, what are we going on to here? It took a long... So the game is very slow feeling for a long time. That initial play of the game with just the miners feels like it's taking a long time for the game to actually get started. And then when the corporations come out, you don't have a lot of shares. You're not getting a lot of cash in your pocket. And the certificates, you're just not buying up companies very fast. You're not looking at this kind of situation where somebody's getting close to certificate limit in the mid-game period of this. It isn't until very late in the game that you have enough money to buy up the shares. So that's a little weird. Another thing is this uses the flat stock market. I keep showing it. This uses a flat stock market with the modifier of if you pay out double your current value. Well, you have to pay out your current value to go forward. You have to pay out double. If you pay out double your current value, you go forward 2 spaces. If you pay out 0, you go back a space. This is becoming more common. I like the mechanism, but it does mean that if you're able to get big runs, you're able to increase your stock value a lot all at once. We got to cut the vid and come back. And there are a lot of special big cities in this game. Things that generate more than the $40 limit that you're going to see in most XX games. And there's a red off-board location, New York City, that produces 100. And then the Boston tile produces 100. New Haven produces 70. Hartford 60. So you've got a lot of locations in the game that are going to produce a decent amount of money. So even in the mid-game, you're seeing some fairly big runs for companies that are well set up for them. But in the end game, because of the way those E-trains double up, and because of the fact that it's almost expected that you end up with 2 permanent trains in this game per corporation. And there aren't all that many corporations. You end up with really, really big runs. Like, you might get to 100 a share paying out. And that means you're going to be going forward double for a long time as you get towards the top of the stock market. So that's pretty big. Like I said, you could redeem shares. This gives you the bootstrapping mechanism that lets you get your second permanent train. If you already have either extra cash on your company when you buy your first permanent train, or shares that are left over, either because you didn't look particularly interesting before that and nobody was buying you out, or you didn't have to release all your shares in order to float your first permanent train, whatever, you're going to start collecting some money. And if there's loose shares in the bank pool, you can start using that money to buy up those shares and start taking advantage of the exceedingly high stock inflation that occurs in this game. So that's kind of interesting. You have the option to full swallow, half swallow, or full payout. The half swallow just means you pay out half the money that you would, and the other half goes in your company treasury. That gives you a fair amount of flexibility as to how much your company wants to pay out. In general, you pay out full all the time, especially since you probably have a fair number of shares sitting in your company treasury through most of the game. Companies that don't end up in that position and end up having to buy their first permanent train kind of squeaking by, end up in a problematic position where they're not going to get that second permanent train easily. I did not see many half swallows. I didn't see a single actual swallow, I think. Because so much cash was flowing into the companies due to the shares that were there. And what that means is the train rush is actually pretty fast once it actually gets started, right? But it's not fast the way 1830s is. So 1830s stock train rush is based on there aren't enough trains. You know, the 4 train kills the 2 is fine, no big deal there. But there aren't enough permanent trains before you get to the diesels. So you end up in a really, really tight situation where everybody knows they want to buy those relatively cheap trains. First of all, the diesel is really expensive. It's $1,100 in 1830. Here, the big train, the 8E, is only $800. Now, $800 is still a big pile of cash, but it's significantly less, which means that those big trains are within easier reach. But also, there are more 5Es and more 6Es than there generally are, and the same amount of corporations. And that means it's relatively possible to get yourself to that second permanent train once the first one falls. Now, the 5 train doesn't kill anything in this game. The 6 train will kill the 3s. Again, that's pretty standard. But it takes a little longer to get to that 6 train in terms of total number of companies because there's an extra 5 train. There's an extra 6 train, so it takes a little longer to get to the 8 for the 4s to die. So it's fairly possible to get yourself to where you don't have to swallow, and you may not end up being put in a position of making a forced train purchase. We did see some forced train purchases, mainly on the miners, but that's besides the point. Your miners have the capability to last the entire game, which leads to an interesting option, which is just keep taking that 50-50 split in money. You're not going to gain any stock value on them, but they do produce very good revenue if you can get a permanent train on them. And they might be a home for an extra permanent train that you have that you don't have a place for and you can't get rid of easily. That'll allow you to buy bigger permanent trains over on your main corporation. Just some interesting concepts here. And honestly, I think I put a 6E, like I had a 5 and a 6E on one of my corporations, and I put the 6E over on the minor because it would make me more money than the major corporation. But that ended up being a bad choice later in the game when I was able to buy an 8E, and then basically I'm running a 6E on my minor and a double 5 on my major because that 8E doesn't do me any special favors, and it would have been more useful to be running the double six, perhaps. The miners aren't going to be able to run 2 permanent trains. Ever, right? I think it's ever. I don't remember. Yeah, because the 4 train drops the miners to just holding 1 train per. It is possible for a one brief period to have 3 permanent trains on a company, on a corporation, but the first 6 train will ruin that. So it's probably not unless you're shifting trains, and that's why it happens. You're probably not going to be doing it, and you're not going to take too much of a chance there. Okay. The release of shares. Release of shares happens last in your operating round, which means you have to plan ahead to do this. In 1870, this wasn't the case. In 1870, you were allowed to just release your shares and, you got the cash and you could buy your train immediately. But I've been noticing in the games that have come out more recently, when share release is done, it's done as the last thing in the turn after you've bought trains. Which means you have to look at your valuation and say, I can buy this train on the next turn or whatever. It requires a little bit more pre-planning than I like. I'm not really a pre-planning person. But it works out pretty well. It's just you have to make that decision of releasing those extra shares long before the time that you actually get to pay them out. And there might be a stock round in between when people are buying your shares anyway, and it's like, great, they've done bad things to me somehow. Okay. So, if you run out of trains on a corporation, yeah, you're still required to purchase a train, and you're going to have to pay out of pocket if you have to. But if your miner company runs out of trains, you can choose just to close it. And then the miner company just goes away, and you get nothing for it. It's not a good solution, but it might be a better solution than trying to start a corporation with a miner company that couldn't afford a train, right? Mergers are kind of cool because they allow 2 minor companies that are connected to each other to turn into one major corporation with a higher par value and the combined resources and dots that those two miners have. It may not always be the best choice, though. Like, I found myself making decisions not to merge minor companies because the miners are too valuable on their own. So even though I was set up with the option, like, 2 that were very close to each other that connected, I didn't want to do that. I saw questions about whether this would be a good first 18XX game. I don't think it's a terrible choice for a first one, except for one thing. The concepts here are so different from sort of the main line of the 18XX that I still recommend I recommend 1830 as your best first choice, because it's going to blow you away, right? Discovering the things you can do in 1830 is just such a mind-bending experience. There were the simplified, less painful in terms of there was less psychopathic behavior that you could have with your corporations. 18GA, 18AL, there are probably some others. Those 2 are free print and play ones. They're not bad choices, but because they're so much less cutthroat than 1830, I feel like they don't give you that full experience. But 1830 has a lot of subtlety to how cutthroat you can actually be in it, in terms of manipulating stock values, all kind of other stuff. One nice thing about this game is it cuts some of that away. Is it still cutthroat? I found the track lay to be cutthroat. The tokening, the train rush could be brutal. But for the most part, I would say this is a really sort of mellower type of play. And I know a lot of people prefer that. I know that's one of the things that people like about 1846, for example, is that it, sort of eases you into the 18XX experience more. I feel like this kind of does that too, but with a higher level of chaos than most XX games manage. And chaos is one of the great things of XX. It's basically the more players you have at the table, because there's no randomness in most XX. Here there's a random setup situation. There's a random setup in 62, but beyond the random setup type situation, all the chaos emerges from it. You don't roll dice. All the decisions are, or all the effects of the game are made just by decisions of the players, and there's no luck or whatever in the play of an 18XX game in general. The exception is 53, but with its random event cards and whatnot, sometimes. Sometimes Tresham got a little weird. Let's just say that. But yeah, 1830 has a humongous amount of chaos in the train rush, in the manipulation of stock values, in the dumping of corporations, all kinds of things. And that chaos, I think, is beautiful and makes the game more interesting. But I think this one has a similar chaos. Just it comes from different sources. It doesn't come from stock manipulation. It doesn't come from dumping companies. It comes more from manipulation of the train rush than anything else, I think. It certainly felt chaotic to me. Maybe this would end up not being chaotic. Now, early in the game, it's completely not chaotic. Like, you have no choices. In 1830, you have huge choices right at the beginning of the game. Do I buy 4 2 trains on my B&O or B&M or whatever, company that could run that many trains? Do I just try to run a company into the ground real early? You don't have that. You have a minor company, you have a 2 train, and you run it how it's meant to be run, and that's all the choice you have. And that felt like I was really worried about the game when I saw that. When I saw that factor of it, I was like, wow, this doesn't feel like, it's got anywhere near the chaos I wanted. But this game really surprised me and managed to generate a level of chaos that I didn't think it was going to do. And that's an important facet. Like, unless an 18XX is strictly for a beginner type play, I think it should have a fair amount of chaos in it. And this one has impressed me by having right up there, at least right now it feels like, with some of the big boys. And given how it managed it. Now, my main opposition to this game, or criticism of it, is that in a few places, 18XX has always been about making a playable economic model that sort of realistically models the stock market. Maybe not always about. Since 1830, it's felt like it was about that to me. And it felt like there were some that failed to do that. All along, that gameplay element, make it a playable game, has gotten in the way of the realistic model, but the compromises that were made were kind of understandable, and some of them, maybe there's no realistic alternative for them. Let me get another battery in. This one took that focus of, hey, how can I model the economics of the stock market, and how that would move and whatnot in a playable manner, and kind of took it and said, well, how can I make an interesting gameplay variant on some of the core mechanisms of 18xx without really trying too hard to model a different, a different element that's been ignored or whatever. And I've generally favored and always, what hooked me on 18xx was, sure, they made some compromises for gameplay that are unrealistic, but they also went further towards dealing with what stock value, how stocks should be valued than any other game has managed to. Now, I've brought up before the most realistic attempt to model the stock market for somebody, who's a big player, able to, deal as a huge investment firm amongst a few others, is Maxi-Bourse. But unfortunately, Maxi-Bourse doesn't take into account the fact that none of the big players control the entire market. So it uses the real mechanisms of the stock market, essentially, in a way that, at a scale that doesn't make sense, and that the entire market is just determined, a player can basically inflate the price of a stock just by, mechanisms that, to a degree that is not possible. Okay, I'm not saying that there are corporations, there are holding companies that manipulate, hedge funds and whatnot, that manipulate the value of a stock, and they do it, in the most ruthless fashion possible, and it's actually still legal somehow. When it shouldn't be. Because there's collusion involved in these things. But even if there wasn't collusion, a hedge fund that was big, a fund that's big enough, could manipulate a small stock and, play it out for their own profit very easily. And in and of itself, that should not be possible. Well, Maxi-Bourse takes that and just, geometrically expands it so that there's like however many players, 6 players. They just have way too much control over the market on these relatively huge corporations that no one has that much control over the valuation of them. But anyway, where I was going was 18xx covered the, hey, look, there's a public investment nature. The value of a stock is what the public's willing to pay for it, not just what Elon Musk is willing to pay for it. If Elon Musk is willing to buy Twitter at, I don't know, whatever it was, 420 or whatever he chose to be a meme himself, he can do that. And on paper, the price jumps up to that briefly, or close to that, but then it just starts diving because it's not worth that, right? The only reason it was able to make it was through arbitrage type mechanisms. And 18xx completely doesn't, look at it. What it tried to model is the fact that there is an investing public who is driven by player actions, but more how solid the company actually is. It's price to earnings when it comes down to it, really. Uh, at least in this game. But in others, it's, how stable the companies seemed. Where you don't have, like, moving up multiple spaces due to high earnings. It had its flaws. It always did. 1830 didn't handle the IPO properly. 56 probably came pretty close to getting it right in a lot of ways. Others have as well. I have to say that if you want to go for that model, though, some of the Winsome games and things like, I bring up Chicago Express. I don't know if that was the one. But some of these others really, I think, do a better job at modeling the economics of the stock market and of the corporations than 18XX does. And they model the train laying better. And all the same, there's something about 18XX that has me hooked and much more devoted to playing than these other games where, the amount of the company decides what kind of dividend it wants to pay out. The players get shares by how many, what percentage of the company they hold, and that's it. The track lay isn't restricted the way it is in the 18XX tiles. So to some extent, I have to say, I'm starting to look at 18XX, and this game is doing this to me, as more of a, it is a game. It's no longer a model, or it's no longer the best model out there. And so let's judge it more just on the gameplay. Once I'm invested in and like the XX system and understand it to some extent, now it's how can that system be twisted a little bit more? And I think that's what Scott Peterson's doing with this one, is he's decided to twist largely mechanisms that already existed. Maybe take away some mechanisms like being able to float a public corporation to create a particularly unique gameplay experience. And I think it's one that's very, very compelling, actually. This may be one of the very best 18XX games, in my opinion. From a single play. It's showing signs of being really, really not overburdened, yet showing a complexity and chaos in play that I thought was really intriguing. Again, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe after, a half dozen plays or even just 2 or 3, it comes down to, this game doesn't really do it that much. I still have this feeling, though, of, but damn it should be modeling the economics better. The one thing the Winsome games don't do is they don't take into account the outside investors in as rich a fashion as the 18XX games do. But I feel like the other things that they model well kind of make up for that. Some of these corporations were almost entirely held by a small consortium of people. Sure, there might have been shares issued, but they didn't give you... they might have determined the value as well. That's the thing. But there were people with such huge holdings in these corporations. I'm thinking about things like the UP and whatnot. And actually, the UP is weird because, one of the other things, the whole credit mobilier scandal. which was done essentially the same way by the UP's Mirror, which I think was the Western Pacific at the time. But yeah, wow. Anyway, I guess that's about all I have to say. This is one I recommend, at least giving a shot to. See if you like it. I ended up thinking I wasn't going to like it that much because of the modeling flaws that I saw. And the actuality is, now I have a pretty high opinion of it. So, I just found another 18XX. It needs to be moved. My beautiful print and play of 1889 that I didn't make it. A friend of mine made it for me. All right, let's send this up.